Hi and welcome to my OCR A-Level Biology revision with me, Christine. So in this lesson I'm going to look at the mammalian heart structure, which is part of Module 3, Transport in Animals. So the mammalian heart then is made up of cardiac muscle. Now this is called myogenic because it is able to contract and relax in a rhythm, and that's about 60 beats per minute. With adults, we tend to say it's about 70 beats per minute, and that's because there are other factors we have to take into consideration. Now, the most important thing about the mammalian heart is that it is a pumping mechanism. It is needed to pump our blood around the body to ensure that it's delivering the necessary materials, i.e. oxygen, glucose, hormones, and removing any waste products so that the cells can function at their best. So we need to understand that the heart is made up of cells itself, so therefore the heart requires this delivery system to itself. And the coronary arteries are the ones that supply the heart with oxygen and glucose so that they can carry out aerobic respiration. For the contraction and relaxation of the muscles, we need the production of ATP, and therefore we need aerobic respiration to occur. So it's important to note that if there's any blockages in the coronary arteries, that can lead to things like coronary heart disease, or it can lead to a heart attack. So it is important that we understand the different chambers and different structure of the heart and how it is able to do its role in pumping the blood around the body. Now, when we do dissections, we tend to use a pig's heart, and the reason for this is because the pig's heart is actually very similar in size and shape to that of a human heart. So if we look inside the heart, then the first thing I would say to you to note the difference between the two is to ensure that you can distinguish between the left side of the heart and the right side of the heart. So whenever you're given a diagram, it's important that you look at a few features. If you are looking at the diagram, imagine that the paper is flipped and pressed against your chest to work out which side is left and which side is right. That is a way in which you can determine between the two. The other part is by looking at the thickness of the wall. So I always, if I've got a diagram of a heart, draw a line down the middle so I can distinguish between which side's left and which side's right. So then if I start with my left side then, I also like to use the alphabet to help me to remember which of the chambers linked to which vessels. So our pulmonary vein is a vein, so that is going to lead into the heart. So the pulmonary vein has come from the lungs, and the blood is going to flow from the pulmonary vein into the heart, into the left atrium. The blood will then flow down through the bicuspid valve, and it will flow into the left ventricle. It will then flow out through the aorta. So it's important when we look at the left side, if I use my alphabet A to L, the left atrium, the bicuspid valve, the left ventricle, and the aorta, all of these start with letters between A to L. So that helps me to remember that the aorta is on the left side. And my bicuspid valve, bi means two. There are two parts to this valve, and that bicuspid valve is on the left side because the wall of my ventricle on the left side is much thicker. Now if I move over to my right side, I can use the alphabet again, my M to Z. So this time we're going to start with the vena cava. The vena cava comes from the superior vena cava at the top, the inferior vena cava, and both of those lead into the right atrium. So they are the veins that are going to lead into that right atrium. The blood will then flow through the tricuspid valve down into the right ventricle and then out through the pulmonary artery. So as you can see, when you look at the alphabet, the vena cava, the right atrium, the tricuspid valve, tri meaning three parts of the valve, the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. They all sit in my alphabet from M to Z. Now, the pulmonary vein does not follow suit with my alphabet, so I always tend to leave that one till last when I'm trying to label the structures. But it is important that you note the different sides and what happens. So, left side, pulmonary vein, left atrium, bicuspid valve, left ventricle, aorta, body. If it's the right side, it's the vena cava, the right atrium, the tricuspid valve, the right ventricle, the pulmonary artery, to the lungs. So whenever we are looking at the flow of blood, you need to know that chain of events and where it goes. So I always use the alphabet to help me. Now I want to talk about these valves a bit more, so that we understand that the reason that we have valves is to prevent the backflow of the blood. We want the blood to always flow from the atria into the ventricles, from the ventricles out through the arteries. So we need to ensure that the blood is never flowing backwards. So we do that by having what's known as our atrioventricular valves, which are the valves in between the atria and the ventricle. Now the bicuspid is on the left side, remember, because B is in my alphabet A to L, and my tricuspid is on the right side because the T is M to Z. Well, if I look at this picture here, I can clearly see the size of the walls, the thickness of the walls of the ventricles is much greater on the left side than it is on the right side. And therefore, I only require 2 parts to my valves on my left side, which is why it's a bicuspid valve, whereas on my right side, because there is a thinner wall, there requires 3 parts to the valve. Now, the other parts that we need to understand is that to go to the artery, the aorta or the pulmonary artery, we need another type of valve, and they're known as your semilunar valves. So if we actually were to look at a heart and we were to dissect it, so I dissected a pig's heart, and here you can see my atrioventricular valve, which is seen from that right atrium. So you can see that there is a opening. Now that's because the pressure of the blood flowing into the atrium is greater than the pressure in the ventricle, and that therefore means that the blood will be able to trickle through into the ventricle from the atrium. Now when the atria contract fully, that will push those valves open even further. So to start with, the valve is only slightly opened as blood slowly flows in. So when the heart is relaxed, when it's in what's known as diastole, the blood is trickling in from the veins into the atrium, and it's trickling down into the ventricle because those valves are only slightly open. Now it's important to note that the pressure in the atrium is greater than the pressure in the ventricle, which is why that valve is open. Now we do need to note those semilunar valves, they will be closed if there is a higher pressure above than below. And remember, because we're talking about an artery and the fact that the artery has the wall, and those walls which have elastin fibers that can recoil, that maintains that high pressure in that artery. So the valves are there to prevent the backflow of blood. So if we then move down and we look at the open atrioventricular valve, so if we have got the blood being pushed out of the atrium as the atria contract down into the ventricle, that atrioventricular valve is going to open fully. Now, if the pressure becomes greater in the ventricle as the ventricle starts to contract, so the pressure is greater than in the ventricle than in the aorta, If the if the pressure is greater in the ventricle compared to the atrium, what will happen is the blood will push those valves to close. So I'm showing this here with my forceps holding the valves together. But what actually happens is as the blood fills with that contraction, it fills up behind the back of the valves, it causes that valve to close, therefore preventing the blood from flowing backwards back into the atrium. Now, because the ventricles are contracting, they're at a higher pressure, that is going to be greater than the pressure in the aorta or the pulmonary artery, and that therefore means that the semilunar valve is now going to be open because the blood, as it's being squeezed out, is pushing through, opening those semilunar valves. Now, when we get to the point where the heart is relaxing and therefore the pressure in the ventricle has become lower than the pressure in the artery, that will cause those semilunar valves to fill up, the little pockets that will fill up with blood. And as they fill up with blood, that will cause them to actually close. So those semilunar valves will only close when the pressure in the ventricle drops below the pressure in the artery. And that's both the pulmonary artery as well as the aorta. And the reason for that is, remember that elastin fiber in the artery wall allows for that stretch and that recoil, maintaining a high pressure in the artery to ensure the blood continues to flow all the way around the body and to the lungs. So if you like this video, then please do click the like button and subscribe to my channel. Also, do check out my revision platform, www.aiqchat.com, to help you to revise.